Greetings and bienvenue, Midnight Crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast. And welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
This is a real experience that happened to me when I was around 10, camping with my family at Butterpot Provincial Park in Newfoundland, Canada in the mid-1980s. In Newfoundland, there is a lot of traditional folklore about fairies and being fairy-led. For example, being sort of mesmerized and stolen away by the fairies, and although I've never really believed in that stuff, whenever I hear those tales I can't help but think about this experience. We arrived at the campground around mid-afternoon. I remember that it was strangely empty. We saw no other occupied sites as we drove around, looking for the perfect spot. We picked our site, and as my parents were setting up, my older sister asked if she and I could go check out the little beach area, which was a short walk along a clearly marked downhill path through some birch woods. Our mom said yes, but told us to be back in 2 hours. We found the sign pointing us to the beach trail and headed down the path. Almost as soon as we were out of sight of the campground, things started to feel off. It was weirdly quiet, with a sort of muffled feeling. No birds calling, no breeze, just a thick, velvety silence. I also noticed that there were strange-looking ferns growing thickly along the path all around us. Ferns are not an unusual sight in the Newfoundland woods, but these were different from the ones I'd seen before. Bright, almost luminous green, and very, very large, some were as tall as I was. I couldn't shake the feeling that there were people or animals hiding in them, watching us pass by. Although it had been a lovely, clear day, the weather started to change as we walked. A low-lying fog rolled in as we descended, first in tendrils close to the ground, then gradually rising around us as we went lower toward the water. Even living in Newfoundland, I'd never walked into a fog like that before, and it did nothing to relieve the eerie feeling that I was trying to ignore. Finally, we arrived at a steep set of wooden stairs, and following them we emerged onto a small, foggy beach. With the woods behind and above us, it felt very closed in, and I started wishing that we were safely back with our parents at our campsite. My sister made a small noise beside me, and I turned to see what had caught her attention. Although I'd thought we were alone, I now noticed that there was a man, several meters away, standing very still and gazing silently out over the water. My sister called out a friendly hello. It was Newfoundland in the 80s, people did that sort of thing, but he didn't move or appear to hear her. After a minute or two I started to feel nervous, so I talked my sister into heading back to our campsite. This is where things get a bit fuzzy. I don't remember leaving the beach, but the next thing I knew we were on a wide, unfamiliar dirt road. It seemed like no time had passed, but I was tired and my legs and feet felt like I'd been walking for a long time. The sun was also pretty low in the sky, which was strange because I thought we'd been gone for less than an hour. I felt disoriented and had no idea where we were, and I started to panic a bit, thinking we were lost. My sister immediately went into protective older sibling mode, saying not to worry because she was pretty sure she knew the way back. We headed off down the road in the direction she suggested, and walked for about 45 minutes or so until we finally emerged at the campground, not far from our campsite. It was now almost completely dark, and we ran to our trailer to find our dad there worriedly asking where we had been. Although we thought we'd been gone for less than 2 hours, my dad said we'd been gone for more than 5. He said that our mom had headed to the beach to look for us while he'd stayed to wait for us at the campsite. By now full-on darkness was setting in, and our dad was worried that our mom had not returned with us. As he prepared to go out looking for her, she burst in the door, frantically saying that she'd run up and down the trail multiple times and still hadn't found us. She was amazed when she saw us. The only way to access that beach, aside from cutting through steep, thick woods, was to take that trail, and we had not passed her. Once we'd all calmed down, we ate dinner and headed to bed. As I lay in my bunk, I remember hearing my mom quietly tell my dad how creepy and strange the trail had felt. Although we'd planned to stay longer, we packed up and left quickly the following morning, and never returned to that campground.
About 8 years ago, me and 2 of my friends were driving to a little town called Branch, Newfoundland, about 2.5 hours from St. John's where we lived. We were bringing my friend back to his cabin to get a car his uncle was fixing. So on the way back, D is in front of his car and M and I are in M's car. It is maybe an hour or 2 after sunset. Prime time for wayward moose on the highway. So D is up front with his high beams and we are 20 feet or so behind, trying to stay in the wash of his headlights. Sure enough, 10 minutes later, a baby moose and its mother wandered across the road, so we slowed down, keeping our eyes on the woodline just behind the ditch on the side of the road. A few turns later, we speed up a little, and with that, in the ditch, on the left side of the road is a giant human-shaped hairy ape. We all saw it when Dee's headlights lit him up, and as our tail lights hit him, he was doing that turning back look from the Patterson film. The damn thing was eye level with me sitting in the car, and it was standing in the ditch staring at me with dark green eyes from the reflection, and without pause it took 2 strides out of the ditch into the woods. None of us had cell phones, so we planned to stop at an old train bridge over an old waterfall, and when we pulled up beside Dee's car and rolled down the window, Dee leaned over and said, "Did you guys see the hairy naked man in the ditch?" We were speechless, and no one wanted to get out of the car, so we just got back on the road and left. Yes, we have bears, and I have seen bears stumble on hind legs, but this was no bear.
In the late 1960s, I lived in a house with some particularly chatty spirits. I've had the goosebumps because I've not seen, but heard, ghosts talking in the house I grew up in on Blackmarsh Road. My grandmother, my grandfather, mother, and myself have all had chance meetings with the supernatural beings on Blackmarsh Road, west of Purity Factories Limited. I had my first encounter with the local ghosts took place in my family's home when I was about 9 years old, around the year 1968 or 69. I grew up there with my 3 sisters. Sometimes, due to limited space, I slept on the sofa in the living room. In the living room was a small stove and coat closet. I remember the chimney ran next to the closet. I remember so vividly being woken up between 3 or 4 a.m. every morning to the sounds of a group of people conversing in the closet. To the best of my knowledge, there were 6 or 7 people. I could not pick out what they were saying, though at the moment I could hear them very clearly. This went on until we moved. I told my mother about this at the time it was happening, but, of course, it was dismissed as a child's imagination until many years later. Long after I moved out of the property, my grandparents had moved into the same apartment. I was away working in Toronto. I was talking to my mom, and we happened to start talking about the closet. She told me my grandmother was asleep one night when she, too, was roused from sleep by the sound of people talking in the living room. She went to check it out, and she also heard many voices in the closet. Grandmother was not one to let noisy spirits invade her closet. Being the strong-willed person that she was, she spread sage throughout their apartment. When she was finished, she said the voices stopped, never to be heard again.
As with many things that terrify us and cause us to question ourselves or the reality around us, I tend to keep this close to the chest, quiet and buried, where I put the things I hope to forget. A bit of background. I grew up in a large city in eastern Canada. The whole of my life at that point had been spent around noise and light, traffic and tides of people. It made the concept of quiet solitude very appealing, and I'd learned to seek these things out and appreciate them whenever I could. So when the opportunity arose to visit my parents' home, I took it. This is because they grew up in the far eastern part of Canada, in Newfoundland. Not even from the big city there, but from a small town. One of those towns you can see all of by standing on the biggest street within it. A remote part of a remote island in a remote country seemed like gold to me, especially at that time in my life. I was in my early 20s. I took off straight out of college, aimed at a career, intent on making my mark. But the city I was in wasn't particularly accepting of my skills or the language I spoke, so finding work was difficult and depressing. I gamed a lot more than I should have. I ate more. I drank more. Everyone thought it was a good idea for a change of pace. Healthy, even. Of the trip, I will only describe our descent, for it is the most opportune use of the word I will ever know. If you've never been in a small plane, at night, flying above a sea of clouds during a full moon, then you are missing one of the few plane-based pleasures available to people in the era of manned flight. It's magical. The sky looked like wet, black tarmac in headlights, so many stars, there seemed to be more than the sky could hold. Hovering in the middle of them was this spotlight of a moon, almost too bright to look at. These things together lit the rolling clouds beneath the plane. It looked like pillow stuffing, spread out horizon to horizon, all cast in a silver blue light. It felt like I could walk on it, like it was only a few feet below the fuselage. It moved and breathed and changed as we flew over it. It really is a perfect memory. Then we dove down, through that perfection, into darkness. We arrived at a small airport outside of their hometown. We could have driven from St. John's but elected not to. Overnight driving in Newfoundland is perilous for people not accustomed to small roads and wildlife that still remains mostly wild. If your car hits a moose at 60 kilometers per hour, the moose won't be what gets scraped off the road. We still had some driving to do though. Their hometown was not where we would be staying, but at a been-in-the-family-for-years cabin about 30 minutes away. In the woods. My lifestyle back on the mainland, fueled by disappointment and depression, had given me two things I couldn't shake when I landed. A desire to be outside, and a completely messed up internal clock. I was so used to playing Ultima Online until 4 a.m. every night, that 2 a.m. felt pretty early. So when my parents went to bed, I let them know I was going for a walk. They understood, and Newfoundland is not known for violent crimes in the woods, so there was no real concern. I took a flashlight and a walking stick, mostly to avoid turning an ankle and for swatting away any unwanted attention from local fauna. Not that a broomstick, literally, would do much against an aggressive animal, but if you've ever gone walking anywhere not fully tamed, it just feels good to have something solid in your hands. So off I went. Now, ever since our descent, I'd been concerned. This general sense of tension. I attributed it to a new place, no real creature comforts, except some books, and a lack of computers. Maybe it was just the absence of that amazing scene above the clouds. Whatever it was, that feeling ratcheted up several levels just a few minutes from the house. I shelved it. I figured I'd acclimate shortly, and this was a clearly defined walking path that I knew circled around the small lake next to the cabin, and would bring me right back there in a couple kilometers. Probably a 45-minute walk if I kept a good pace, an hour if I was a bit more casual. The whole way around, would be able to see the cabin, so I wouldn't lose my orientation. All in all, I'm trying to say I had my bases covered. I even had light, as the moon I'd seen earlier was still overhead, poking out from the overcast sky regularly enough to see. The clouds were fast, as they can be so close to the sea. So, I'm walking down the path. Woods to my right, thick, impenetrable pine, and to my left the small lake, lit like glossy black, frosted glass by the wind and the moon. Solo walks are great for thinking. So I let my mind wander. The path was well kept, and the stick and flashlight utterly unnecessary. At some indeterminate point in the walk, I felt someone walk over my grave. You know those slow chills, when you can feel the wave of goosebumps appear, flowing up your back, neck, forearms, and everything goes tight. I realized I was staring at the lake, at the white noise of the reflected light, and not paying attention to the woods. I became irrationally certain that something terrible was in the woods. I flicked on my flashlight as I turned to look, and it was like sinking in a hot tub. The goosebumps vanished, and the woods seemed utterly unremarkable. Mollified, I continued walking. Then it happened again. Exactly the same feeling. Once again, I realized I was absent-mindedly staring at the lake, wondering if my house was going to go to in danger of collapsing in Ultima Online. I remember that specifically. At this point, I noticed the cabin almost directly across from me beyond the lake. I am about as far as I'm going to get from the house during my walk, and all I want to be is back there with one of my books. As this thought crosses my mind, I notice that a small part of the reflection on the lake is missing. It's just gone, like someone went over it with a Sharpie. So I look at that spot. Focus on it. Of all the bad decisions in my life, that's the one I would wish to take back the most. Even while my Homo sapien brain is trying to assign some reason for this absence of reflection, half-sunk boat, thicket of reeds, weird stone outcropping, my lizard brain is telling me to back off as fast as I can. The spot is getting bigger. It is something, man-shaped, walking out of the water toward me, very clearly walking, backlit by the moon. I'm frozen. I can't move. It's getting close to shore when I realize I still have a flashlight, one of the big ones people in cabins like to keep around. I drop my stick, fumble with the flashlight, not breaking eye contact with this thing. I find the switch, which was right where it should be, under my thumb, but hey, panic, and shine it at this man shape. Of course, there's nothing there at all. Just water and moonlit reflections all the way back to the cabin. I swear I stood there for 5 minutes, motionless except for my eyes which were grid-searching the entire lake. Finally, I decide I'm imagining things. Despite every inch of me still screaming to run. I decide I will head back the way I came at double speed. I flick the light switch off to get my night sight back. The thing is exactly where it would be if it hadn't stopped approaching, right where I had been pointing my light. Close enough now to start obscuring part of the cabin. Literally visible in the dark, but not in the light. I froze for some amount of time. Probably only a few seconds, but felt like a lot longer. It got closer. Lake water moves noisily, but regularly. You watch reflection on it, and it's just noise. There are no regular waves or anything. It's just a constant shimmer. The edges of this thing were like that. It was hard to notice at first, because just the lake was behind my view of it. But as it eclipsed the cabin, and some of the ground, I very clearly saw its edges move just like the lake. Some people have said scribbles, some have said static. I feel like these are synonymous descriptions of what I saw. At about 10 feet, I realized there wasn't going to be any kind of stopping. It wasn't going to stop and say something. I dropped the flashlight, heard it break, and sprinted back to the cabin. I fell once, skinning my shin pretty roughly, but made it back to the cabin in about 10 minutes, wasn't in great shape. I get back to the house. My head is pounding, ears roaring, I'm nauseous. I stumble in and collapse into the downstairs bedroom, 2-floor cabin, parents upstairs. They are undisturbed by my noisiness, and I collapse into bed. Then I notice my one window is framing the lake like a painting. Everything just outside the window is pitch black, moon on the other side of the house. I decide I can't deal with that, so I go back out to the main room and close all the doors and windows I can see and sleep on the sofa. At some point hours later, crashing from the adrenaline and the run, I fell asleep. Next morning, my parents woke me up coming downstairs. They asked me why I'm sleeping on the couch, fully clothed, and why my jeans are ripped. I'm too self-conscious at this point to say anything close to the truth, so I just say I fell, lost the flashlight and had to come back and just fell asleep on the couch by accident. They buy it. I didn't sleep well, or much, at all, so I decided to go to actual bed and get some actual sleep. I walk over, open the door to my room, and lying perfectly aligned on the bed is the broken flashlight, covered in dirt, and the broomstick. Side by side, like matchsticks. Window locked.
I live on the northern east coast of Newfoundland, Canada. I've heard people say that's where certain kinds of creatures live, but as I previously stated, I know absolutely nothing about it. There's an area extremely deep into the woods, about 40 minutes away from where I live, so deep into the forest that you don't really see anyone else. There's a few smaller stores out that way, but nothing really noteworthy. But if you walk deep into the woods, there's a path cars can't drive through where a burnt-up abandoned slaughterhouse is. Spiritual people I know have said not to go there because it's cursed. A First Nations friend filled me in on that he knows about the area, which he basically said he wouldn't go there. Over the weekend, a few friends and I were bored and decided we'd go check it out since we were in the area. Nothing happened. We just got some photos. It was a bit eerie. The days after we went to that place, we had random bad unexplainable events occur out of nowhere. But here's where I think we had an encounter. Tonight we gathered the same group plus 2 other friends and drove back out there just to show them around to explore more and get better pictures. When we got there, we heard what we assumed was the wind howling. But the longer it went on, we realized the pattern didn't match up with the wind. It didn't make any sense for it to be howling like that, sounding almost as if someone was whistling at us to get our attention. A few people pointed it out, but we just chalked it up to being random sounds. Possibly the wind was probably just blowing through something weirdly. When we were in one of the secondary buildings, a friend pointed out it looked like something was running around outside the main building. He was right. It looked like something very quickly moved across the front side of the building, and the sound was back, but louder. We went outside and crawled through a section in the gate to get back to the main building. As soon as we made it through, we heard a loud swinging sound, almost like a rusty door was being slowly opened and closed. Another friend and I were extremely put off by the sound and asked to go back to the car, but the others said they wanted to go into the main building. As we were walking up to the front of the building, a friend jokingly made a remark about us splitting up and exploring the building, as he said that we heard a series of loud banging, like something was running across the metal floor of the building towards the door. We quickly made it out of there and ran back towards the trail. As we were running back towards the car, which isn't exactly a short walk, we shine our lights back towards the building. The three of us looked back and definitely saw what appeared to be something completely solid white bipedal humanoid running down the trail. We got in the car and drove back to town as quickly as possible. I don't think we'll ever be going back.
I have seen something strange at night driving home and I can't for the life of me figure out what it was. Some people say it was a Newfoundland Bigfoot and I decided to look it up since I haven't heard of one here before. On my way home in February 2017, we had a week of warm weather and my boyfriend and I were driving home from Triton on Highway 389, Causeway. We came around a turn off one of the bridges next to a mussel farm and in the distance I saw something so big that it scared me. It was far enough away that the headlights couldn't shine light on it, but close enough that the rays of light highlighted it just enough for me to see its outline and its eyes lit up like two big saucers. It was back on to us and when it heard the car, it turned its head to look at us. That's when its eyes flared up and I saw just how tall it was standing. At first I thought it was a big moose because of its size. And then I knew it wasn't when it ran off the road so fast the headlights didn't even touch it and I got to see just how huge the limbs were. Anyone knows a moose has skinny little legs, but this one had huge muscular ones, similar to a bear's but also different because its paws were different. It was perhaps maybe a second and a half flat for it to get off the road and go completely out of sight. I slowed down as I neared where I had seen it and tried to look around the ditch, which had a huge clearing before the tree line, with a small cluster of about 5 trees in the middle where it was recently cleared, and the animal was nowhere in sight. Normally I'm naturally curious and would stick around to try to see an animal, but I felt very threatened and very much in danger. So I drove on. I know there are a lot of bears in the area, but I have never seen one that big and I have seen and photographed many bears, since they are so common around and in our towns. It took up most of the road and its reaction to seeing the car and ever so stealthy retreating off the road was so creepy, because you could see it was intelligent, not fearful of the car, just not wanting to be hit by the lights so it can remain in the shadows. It simply didn't want to be seen. It struck me as so smart, so big, so unlike anything I have seen on the island. I thought perhaps it was a bear up early because of the warm weather. But if it was, my God, it was the biggest mofo I have ever seen and it's winter. I mistook it for a freaking full-grown moose. I don't know what I saw, but it's the first time I've ever seen anything like that and it was by far the biggest thing I have seen on the island. I was really frightened and normally I'm excited to see wildlife. My boyfriend didn't see it, but he's night blind, and I have to keep an eye out for moose when he drives and let him know if I see them because my night vision is really good.
In June of 1975, I separated from active duty in the U.S. Navy. I was stationed in Argentia, Newfoundland, Canada, at a joint Canadian and U.S. military facility. Upon separation, I drove from the eastern portion of Newfoundland, the Avalon Peninsula, to Minnesota. A long drive, including some ferry trips, to say the least. I have never been one to listen to the radio much, but this trip was an exception. So I listened first to Canadian stations and then the local U.S. stations as the trip progressed. The Canadian stations frequently played ballads and songs by Gordon Lightfoot, something of a national hero in Canada I have learned. I distinctly remember listening to his song, The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald, and thinking it was a striking tribute to the sinking of a ship and the loss of its crew. Having just served in the Navy, this song had a more immediate impact on me. I also remember not hearing of any reports of a Great Lakes ship sinking in recent years at that time. So I thought the song was about an older nautical tragedy. I thought, time permitting, I would research it, but never got around to it. That was June, 1975. In November 1975, the sinking of the Edmund Fitzgerald made the news. I was puzzled to learn this, thinking that the reporting of it was some kind of mix-up. But I was then busy in school and didn't think any more about it. Then in 1976 Gordon Lightfoot released his song, The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald, which was nominated for a Grammy Award. I learned of this event but, again, being busy with school, I again didn't think much of it. It wasn't until some years later that I realized the inconsistency of my listening to that song in June of 1975, the actual event in November of 1975, and the release and Grammy nomination of the song, The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald in 1976. Perhaps I am remembering incorrectly, but I think not.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel as more green texts will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.
Remember to check out the Odyssey page in the description for a second archive of the channel's videos.